How did New Guinea Force work to develop situational understanding? We look at the joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment. Welcome to episode 110 of the Principles of War podcast, the joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment for the Kokoda Campaign.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Before we get into that, I want to discuss another taboo that we discussed last week, and that is self-inflicted wounds as a part of psychological injury. We started last week's episode by looking at not yet diagnosed Australian psychiatric casualties during the Kokoda Campaign 1942 by David Woolley. He discusses a range of issues on the Kokoda track in regard to psychiatric health of the soldiers. I picked out a couple of examples. One of them was self-inflicted wounds, hands and feet, to soldiers, some of whom were highly experienced from the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions. Unlikely that there'd be such a high number in such a short space of time. It's estimated that there may have been upwards of 30 casualties from the Battle of Isharava of self-inflicted wounds. Army Doctor Captain William McLaren reported to the Assistant Director of Medical Services for the 7th Division, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Norris, self-inflicted wounds were very common. At the start, the left great toe was selected, but owing to the fact that they had to walk, the left hand came into favour. It was estimated that during one battle involving AIF and AMF, nearly 1/3 of the wounds were self-inflicted wounds. The AIF showed greater variation and more cunning. That statement there really highlights the psychological pressure that not only the commanders, but also the soldiers were under during the fighting of the Kokoda Campaign. After reflecting on this, I think two things become really important. Firstly, are we not seeing the tactical fruits of the manourvrist approach? From LWD1, the description of manoeuvre theory includes, its essence lies in defeating the enemy's will to fight by destroying the enemy's plan rather than destroying his forces. In its most kinetic form, manoeuvre seeks to shatter the enemy's morale and physical cohesion through a series of actions orchestrated across multiple lines of operation to a single purpose, creating a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. In this context, manoeuvre is used to create an expectation of defeat in the enemy's mind. Traditionally, I think we've always thought about the enemy's commander's mind. What we're seeing here is the manifestation of the effects on the battlefield for the individual soldiers. Not just the effect of the combat, but also the effect of the environment with which they're in, and for jungle, probably no other worse environment. Overlay that with what they know about the strategic environment. I've just been looking at the front page of the Hobart Mercury from Wednesday the 18th of February 1942. I have to tell you, there's not a lot of good news there. It's talking about Burma preparing for a new assault, the requirement for the total mobilisation of the entire resources of the nation, risks of raids. There's one little bit of good news, and that is that the Nazis have admitted that they've retreated up to 100 miles. But apart from that, it is very dire. The second big takeaway from that, I think, is how do we build the resilience of our soldiers? What role does leadership and realistic training play in generating soldier resilience? Today we're going to look at Major General Basil Morris as the commander of New Guinea Force. His role was to create the Tobruk of the Pacific. We'll look at the resources that he had to conduct his mission. We'll look at the training that he was able to do and the implications for that. And then we're going to start looking at the joint intelligence preparation of the operational environment. What did he get right? What didn't he get right? And how did that impact the conduct of the campaign? After that, we're going to look at how troops could have been better prepared for operating in the jungle environment. Morris was born in 1888. He attended Melbourne Grammar, where he served as a sergeant in the cadets. He went to Melbourne Uni for a year, after which he joined the Melbourne Cavalry, and in 1910 he was commissioned into the Royal Australian Artillery, where he served in the Garrison Artillery. In May 1915, he was appointed to the Australian Imperial Force and posted to a siege brigade. This was renamed to the 36th Australian Heavy Artillery Group. He served on the Western Front, did some time as a staff captain in the 5th Divisional Artillery. He was promoted major and became the battery commander of the 114th Howitzer Battery in September 1918. They fought at Hajicourt and Bellecourt during the advance to the Hindenburg Line, and for his leadership in that period, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. After the war, he was transferred to the Staff Corps and served in a variety of artillery command and staff appointments. In 1937, in Army Headquarters in Melbourne, he was serving as the Director of Supplies, Transport, Movements and Quartering. He was promoted to Colonel in November 1939 and chosen to be the commander of the Australian Overseas Base. In December, he was seconded to the 2nd AIF as a temporary brigadier. He deployed to Palestine in January 1940 and he established the supply base at Jerusalem and remained there until June. He was moved on from that position by Blamey and he becomes the Australian Military Liaison Officer in Bombay. In May 1941, he is transferred to become the Commandant of the 8th Military District, which is headquartered in Port Moresby. He would stay in that position until August 1942, when he was replaced by Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell. The first thing to note with Basil Morris is that in little over 2 years, he has gone from Lieutenant Colonel, through Brigadier to Major General. His substantive rank is Colonel. That means that he's done the courses and he has the required experience to be a full Colonel. Major General, which is the rank of a divisional commander, has significantly more responsibilities. A New Guinea force, with all of the troops that it has under command, is effectively a divisional command. New Guinea force is what the 8th Military District will morph into as the situation becomes more important. We see Morris struggle as a brigadier in the Middle East, moved on by Blamey. Now he's serving as a Major General in New Guinea. This is one of the big dilemmas that face armies as they mobilise rapidly. In 1938, there were 35,000 militia troops and just 2,800 soldiers and officers within the permanent military force. By August 1942, the month of the Battle of Ishirava, the Australian Army had grown to 476,000 men. In the space of just 4 years, the army has grown by a factor of 10. This is why we see so many soldiers and officers with temporary ranks. At the Major General level, those ranks are pretty thin. We saw the impact that that had when we looked at corporals and sergeants and warrant officers within the 53rd Battalion and how training was conducted and how they were able to fight. The lack of training, the lack of skills had a huge impact on their ability to operate effectively in combat. Now we are seeing that impact for officers at the operational level. As we get into the detail of Morris's performance in New Guinea, I'm going to rely heavily on Major General Steve Gow's assessment of his performance in a paper that he wrote, Command in New Guinea. As we assess his performance, it's important to remember that he was out of his depth. He knew that he was out of his depth, and once it became a combat command, it was a command that he did not want. Gow writes, Basil Morris had gone to Port Moresby initially as the commander of the military district. It was seen as somewhat of a backwater, a safe place for a man of his undistinguished record. A gentleman of courtesy and honour, he readily admitted he had no pretensions to being a tactician. Major General George Vasey, the commander of the 7th Division, and it would be his troops who would recapture Kokoda, described Morris as such: a very good scout, no brains, but honest and stout-hearted. Vasey would have worked quite closely with Morris because Morris would go on to command Angao and be responsible for much of the logistics support for the Kokoda Campaign. The troops of the 7th Division called him Bloody George, not because of the Butcher's Bill, but because it was his favourite adjective. One of the most memorable sets of orders that he ever wrote was at Thermopylae in 1941. Here you bloody well are, and here you bloody well stay. And if any bloody German gets between your post and the next, turn your bloody brain around and shoot him up the arse. That is one way that commanders can make sure that their intent is very clear to all of the troops under their command. And one thing about General Vasey, he was very popular with the troops that he commanded. Back to Morris. He has 6 months before the Japanese commence their offensive against the Allies. Whether you're a lieutenant with a couple of 100 metres of frontage in a battalion defensive position, or a major general responsible for Papua and New Guinea and the outer-lying islands, it's really important to understand the terrain that you have responsibility for. It's also your responsibility to ensure that your troops are trained to be able to carry out likely tasks. As we start to assess the performance of Basil Morris, there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. Firstly, he understood the requirement of defending Port Moresby. He understood the need to develop it into the Tobruk of the Pacific. However, that came about after the lightning advance of the Japanese. From their commencement of hostilities, it was less than a month before the 39th and 53rd Battalions came out to join the 49th Battalion, which was already in location in Port Moresby. Up until then, he'd only really had one battalion with which to defend Port Moresby. The threat assessments up until that time had becoming increasingly alarming. However, there was a lot of islands between where the Japanese were and Port Moresby at that stage. As he was doing his appreciation for the defence of Port Moresby, there were a couple of assumptions that he made. Firstly, air power would be decisive. Secondly, the Allied fleet would protect Port Moresby. And thirdly, the Owen Stanleys were impassable. Did he assume away the problems of his command? Even an officer cadet on their second shoot or tactical exercise without troops would know that if you're going to assume some sort of resource in your cunning plan, you need to make sure that it is going to be available. Did he assume that there would be Air Force elements to A, defend Port Moresby, and B, strike at any Japanese that were foolish enough to land within his area of operations? Morris was right from the strategic point of view. When you look at the way that MacArthur conducted his campaign, he would use naval forces to land troops, to seize ground, to build airfields, to extend the reach of his air forces so that his navy could land more troops and seize more ground. But the problem for Morris and the defence of Port Moresby is that this would be in the future. It wouldn't be in the middle of 1942. We will look at 75 Squadron. We will look at the problems with generating air power over New Guinea. But this is probably why he used the 49th Battalion, his only battalion until the 30th Brigade is created. This is why he used the 49th Battalion to build airfields. His second assumption, that the fleet would protect Port Moresby, well, that was correct, but it was a near-run thing. The Battle of the Coral Sea could have gone either way. Some say that in campaigning, you'd rather be lucky than good, and there was a lot of luck on the side of the Allies during the Battle of the Coral Sea. There were many things that could have gone against them that would have seen a dramatically different result and would have seen Japanese troops landing on the beaches of Port Moresby. They were less than 24 hours away. The fact that they got so close, I think, highlights the fact that it was a bold assumption that the fleet would protect Port Moresby. Did he have an alternative? Well, that'll be a question that we'll look at the strategic level. The third assumption, though, that the Owen Stanleys were impassable, well, that is something that he should have known. He could have sent a section up the Kokoda track to look for the gap, that one place where they would have been able to stop an army coming across the Owen Stanleys with just a couple of Vickers machine guns, identify that place on a map. We'll come back to the maps. That never happened, and the concept of the gap permeated Allied planning for far too long. Time and reconnaissance is seldom wasted, and I think that he should have been able to find the resources to be able to conduct that reconnaissance. And even if he couldn't, there were people who knew how passable the Kokoda track was. We mentioned the commander's responsibility for training. So let's have a look at the 49th Battalion. Just how good were they? I would never be so bold to pass such a damning assessment on a battalion. So I'm going to rely on the professional assessment of the Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Vernon Sturdy. In July 1941, he told Morris that the 49th Battalion was the worst in Australia. Now, before we go any further, I just want to make sure that everyone is tracking that this would be no fault of their own. The raising of the 49th, similar to the 39th and the 53rd Battalion, quite ad hoc, quite poorly planned. Troops from the 49th would go on and fight very bravely at Sanananda, and some of those troops would serve over 2 years in New Guinea continuously. That is about 4 times the maximum recognised period of time that soldiers should be serving in jungle climates because of the arduous nature of military service in the high temperatures and the disease-ridden state that they were in. But looking at Sturdy's assessment, I can't help but think that if the Chief of Army told me that a subunit or unit under my command was the worst in the army, I would probably have a look at why that was and look at what could be done to rectify that situation urgently. It does not appear that that had happened. To highlight the issues with the raising, training and sustaining of the 49th Battalion, we will just have a little quote from Gavin Long, the official historian, and he asked the rhetorical question, to what extent was the comparative failure of the militia battalions in New Guinea a product of the blunders in army policy for which the cabinet was responsible? This is a very good question, and when we look at the strategic level, we will answer some of those questions. What was going on in cabinet? What were they trying to achieve? And how were they directing army to achieve those goals? Readiness is a particularly important concept for an army, particularly when it is preparing for combat. In David Horner's book, Crisis of Command, he writes, on the 13th of April 1942, Major General Vasey, the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, wrote to the subordinate army commanders requesting that monthly reports be submitted on the operational efficiency of headquarters and formations down to brigade and detached units. Brigadier Hopkins, the Director of Military Operations and Plans, followed this on the 29th of April with an instruction that the reports were to be classified as follows. Alpha, efficient and experienced for mobile offensive operations. Bravo, efficient as a formation for mobile offensive operations but not experienced. Charlie, individual brigades are efficient for mobile offensive operations but higher training has not been completed. Delta, individual brigades are efficient in a static role, additional brigade and higher training is required. Echo, units have completed training, a considerable amount of brigade and higher training is required. Foxtrot, unit training is not yet complete. Horner continues on. Shortly afterwards, reports began arriving in GHQ Australia. These reports are difficult to evaluate since the commander of a division might have an inflated opinion of his troops, or he might be a harsh realist. Some trends, however, can be detected. As the year progressed, there was an increase in realism, and with it a marked decrease in listed efficiency. So, as a div commander, you might be tempted to say that your division is incredibly well trained because it was your job to train them. However, as there's an increasing likelihood of deploying overseas, maybe you're starting to think that there might be a requirement for more time in training. GHQ prepared a provisional report in early May, and that stated that most of the brigades were at classification Delta. So individual brigades are efficient in the static role, additional brigade and higher training is required. Only the 7th Division AIF and the 19th Brigade AIF were at standard Alpha, so efficient and experienced for mobile offensive operations. However, once the brigade started to submit their own assessments, they were significantly lower. On the 2nd of June, Headquarters 1st Army reported that as at 15th of May, with the exceptions of the 7th Division, which was Category Alpha, and the 2nd Division, which was Category Delta, all formations were of standard Echo. Units have completed training. A considerable amount of brigade and higher training is required. Unit training is at the battalion level, so a battalion of infantry, a regiment of artillery, or a regiment of armour. Critical to note that little combined arms training will have been conducted at that level. That's why it's so important to be able to exercise at the brigade level, because that's where you're really able to develop that combined arms effect. Provisionally, GHQ had rated the 30th Brigade, so this is the 49th, 39th and 53rd, as Category Charlie. Category Charlie, individual brigades are efficient for mobile offensive operations, but higher training has not been completed. Now, this is a little bit concerning because there were people in 30th Brigade who didn't know how to use a Bren gun. If they didn't know how to use a Bren gun, it's highly unlikely they were going to be able to understand how to coordinate offensive support. And indeed, Horner writes that during this period, the 14th Brigade arrived in New Guinea, and General Morris found it to be of standard Echo, and that the 30th Brigade was at standard Foxtrot. Foxtrot, unit training is not yet complete. That would be an accurate assessment. That would be an accurate assessment of the two brigades that are in Port Moresby. When we look at the strategic level, we will look at why the 7th Division was retained within Australia, remembering that the 6th Division was still returning home and the 9th Division was about to fight at 2nd El Alamein. Your divisional commander may be a harsh assessor of combat efficiency, but there is no harsher assessor than the crucible of combat, and the 9th Division would clearly be at Category Alpha. Same for the 7th Division, with all of the combat experience that they've got and the accolades that they've had in combat. In early February 1942, there were air raids on Port Moresby. There was looting by the Australian troops. Morale was extremely low, and the air officer commanding Northeast Area, Air Commodore Lucas, warned the Air Board of the poor morale in Port Moresby. He wrote, "This does not mean that the troops will not fight, but they cannot overlook the lack of naval, air and political support. An impression is growing rapidly that the policy of the government is to let the garrisons at Moresby and Thursday Island go in the same way as that at Rabaul, and that no serious assistance will be given." In March, No. 75 Squadron RAAF would deploy to Port Moresby, and that did lift morale. However, the naval officer in charge at Port Moresby, Commander Hunt, wrote that when the Coral Sea battle was at its height, the army evacuated Moresby, retiring hurriedly overnight to the area of Rowana Falls. At this time, I was not advised by anyone whatsoever, so that when morning came, my small naval staff, a few ACAC gunners, and caretakers of the two First World War 6-inch guns on Parga Hill and the RAAF crews at 3 Mile remained as the sole defence of Port Moresby. Acknowledging the lack of resources that Morris has got, we're still struggling to build an effective force to defend Port Moresby. Horner writes that although Morris was vehemently criticised for the lack of order in Port Moresby in February, Blamey was to judge later, General Morris set about his impossible task with courage and determination. The responsibility lies less with the commander on the spot than with those responsible for providing him with inadequate and incompetent forces. However, the decreasing operational situation and the lack of progress meant that a change of command was required. Horner wrote, on the 12th of August, Raoul assumed command, and the staff of New Guinea Force was absorbed into that of 1st Corps to form a rejuvenated Headquarters New Guinea Force. General Allen, who arrived on the 13th of August, enumerated the problems faced by the Corps. The garrison was inadequate and the morale of many of the troops was dangerously low. The training of the troops was almost non-existent, the organisation of supply dumps was deplorable, and hygiene was most unsatisfactory. Morris was not sorry to be relieved of his heavy responsibility, and he moved into the old Lieutenant General's residence in Port Moresby and assumed command of the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit. Later, Raoul wrote to Blamey that Morris has had a lot to contend with, and none of my people have anything but admiration for the way he battled along. It is all too easy to walk in with experienced people and tidy up a going concern, and we are not a bit disposed to criticise our predecessors. On the 13th of August, however, in a more private letter, he commented, "What it must be to have a bad staff. I am going over his people to see who is to be retained and will dispose of the balance." The truth was that the headquarters in New Guinea had never been formed as an operational headquarters. Originally formed as the headquarters of the 8th Military District, it had no substantial reinforcement when it assumed an operational role. Raoul later virtually admitted this when he discovered the appalling lack of intelligence information. Harking back to the days when he was DCGS, he commented to Vasey, "Perhaps I was to blame in not seeing that Morris got a decent staff." Raoul sought immediately to gain control of the situation, but the main body of his headquarters had not arrived. Until it did on the 17th of August, he would have to rely on Morris's small staff. Morris had already ordered the 53rd Battalion and the headquarters of the 30th Brigade, commanded by the Grand AAF soldier Brigadier Selwyn Porter, to move forward to reinforce the 39th Battalion, and the first troops began to move on the 12th of August. Horner has some interesting things to write about the decision to replace Morris. He states that Blamey was aware of Morris's weaknesses, but he also realised that he could not be blamed entirely for the situation in New Guinea. The answer was to send a new commander to New Guinea and leave Morris to run the administrative elements, and in particular the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit. The remarkable thing was that Blamey delayed so long in making the change, but until the number of troops in New Guinea increased, he could not really do so without hurting Morris's feelings. Blamey always felt a certain loyalty to those officers who had served their country long and well, and through no fault of their own, found themselves in situations that they were not equipped to handle. At the start of 1943, though, Blamey wrote to Herring, "I am not sure that a wise plot was made when Morris was made commander of Angau. It is open to consideration as to whether a real live wire as a brigadier administration Angau would not be a better arrangement." And indeed, when Raoul replaced Morris, he had thought about sending him back to Australia. Let's now have a look at the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment, or abbreviated, the JIPOE. This is the joint version of the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. The doctrine states that the purpose of the JIPOE is to gain and maintain situational understanding for the commander and staff, and to provide indications and assessments of future threat activity likely to adversely affect the mission or friendly force. Although not always practical, as much of the JIPOE as possible should be conducted before a joint planning group convenes. The reality will more likely be the evolving intelligence flow that continually informs joint planning and helps refine the products. The JIPOE is broken into two parts, and each of those parts has two steps. So the first part is the analysis of the operational environment. So step one is define the operational environment, and step two, describe the operational environment effects. The second part is the analysis of the threat. Step three, evaluate the threat. And step four, determine threat courses of action scenarios. Defining the operational environment for Army, this is going to be focused around terrain, and we would use OCOCA. So observations and fields of fire, cover and concealment, obstacles, key and decisive terrain, avenues of approach, weather, and then we're going to be looking for the impact on observation of fire and the impact on mobility. Observations and fields of fire. Now, this is very interesting because there was very little work done in the jungle, even though the majority of the fighting was going to be done in the jungle. So the terrain, the vegetation around Port Moresby was light scrub. This has a really big impact on not only the way that the soldiers fight, but the kind of training that they need to be able to fight in the jungle. As we've seen, the troops, before they headed up to the Kokoda track, did not get any of that training. And here we have a failure to correctly define the operational environment. There's no point having troops training in light scrub when they're going to be fighting in jungle. Let's try and think about the combat, though, at a larger than platoon or company level. How are we going to adjust indirect fire if we can't see very far? And the artillery officers would develop a system where they would do sound ranging. So they would call the artillery in, and they would progressively get it closer using sound alone. For the troops fighting in the Kokoda Campaign, there was very little Allied artillery support, and they would have to wait until the Battle of the Beaches before they started to get adequate artillery support. Secondly, we've got cover and concealment. So remembering that cover is protection from the effects of weapons, and concealment is protection from observation. The nature of the concealment on the Kokoda track was one of the reasons why Australian troops were able to effect a lot more ambushes than particularly the 7th Division troops who had come from the Middle East, come from the desert. Very hard to be able to ambush, and particularly at the ranges where you'd want to be able to conduct an ambush. That's hard to do in the desert, much easier to be able to do in the jungle. Next comes obstacles. Now, these can either be natural or man-made, and it's anything that stops, impedes, slows, or diverts movement. What did everyone know about the Kokoda track, and how was that going to impact mobility? Well, this is a very good question, because there were some people who thought that if you had enough manpower, you would be able to build a road over it. This is why it's really important for people to go up to the front and actually understand the situation, understand the environment under which the troops are operating, because it's a little bit silly to be suggesting that you could build a road from Port Moresby up to the beaches on the northern coast. Clearly, the jungle and the mountains represented an impassable obstacle for vehicle movement. We see the photos of the Golden Stairs, an effort to make it easier to traverse by foot up those big mountains, and there was lots of creeks, lots of rivers, some of which were very fast flowing. While we're having a look at those obstacles, this is where you would start to think maybe it would be worthwhile requesting engineer support, because they would be able to help with creek crossings and river crossings and potentially cutting some paths through some of the areas. Next, we've got key and decisive terrain. Key terrain is any terrain which, if controlled, will give a marked advantage to whoever controls it. Decisive terrain is the terrain that will provide an extraordinary impact on the mission. So the mission will depend on seizing or retaining that terrain feature. Now, is there any decisive terrain on the Kokoda track? So the gap would represent decisive terrain, because if you put a section in the gap, they would be able to hold it against all comers. This would be our Thermopylae, apart from 6th Division's Thermopylae, which was actually at Thermopylae. But this was the opportunity to stop all comers from coming up from Kokoda up the track. They could have been stopped at the gap. There was one big problem with the gap, and that was the fact that it didn't actually exist. But this is something that Morris was relying on. He thought that the track was impassable, but there was a gap where anyone coming up that track would be able to be stopped. If you're relying on some decisive terrain, you should probably at least look at it. You should probably get an understanding of, does it actually exist? Is it going to convey that extraordinary advantage to me in the fulfillment of my mission? Morris was trying to create the Tobruk of the Pacific. If he holds that one spot, then from the landward side, he has secured Port Moresby. I'd be thinking I need to recon that pretty extensively because, like the other Thermopylae, is there a goat track around it? Are troops going to be able to get around and avoid that obstacle and negate that extraordinary advantage that I think I hold? I would argue that Kokoda was key terrain because you would have a marked advantage if you held it, and this is why when it was lost, there was a lot of pressure to try and regain it very quickly, and that was because there was an airfield there, so supplies could be flown in to Kokoda. Same for Myola. Lastly, we want to think about avenues of approach. How wide are they? What kind of mobility are they going to permit? As a mobility corridor, some of those avenues approaches, some of those tracks are very narrow. They would only permit a single file of soldiers to be traversing them at any one time. This created huge logistics problems because this is what you want to be able to do. You've got to pull out the so what of your terrain analysis. There's no point in saying that there's narrow tracks without actually then starting to think about, well, how are we going to get supplies up there? How far does it need to go? How long is that going to take? How many people are we going to require to carry all of that? When we talk about the sustainment piece, we're going to look at the problems that came around because of that. That incredibly tenuous supply line, this was one of the reasons that increased the importance of retaining those airfields. When we think about mobility, you can move through the jungle. Now, it's good if you've been trained to do that. It makes it a lot easier. But we see multiple times from multiple battalions, individuals, sections, platoons, companies being cut off, ending up behind the lines and then working their own way back, cutting their way through the jungle. That movement rate, though, was very slow, partially because they were trying to do it quietly so they weren't drawing enemy interest, and partially because it's just very, very hard work. As good staff officers, once you've gone through the appreciation of the ACOCA factors of the terrain that you've got, you then create your modified combined obstacles overlay, which is where you would do the colouring in of the maps that you've got. Now, there was one issue with that for the Kokoda campaign, and that was there were no maps. The best that some of the officers had was a list of how far down the track each of the various villages were. That was all they had. And so I think back to Lieutenant Rolly Logan and getting lost on the Kokoda track. Well, you think about that and you think, how could you get lost on the track? Well, the Kokoda track's a bit of a misnomer because there's actually a lot of tracks that go off from the main track. So it would be quite easy to get lost. There was no maps. So very difficult to know if you're on the main track, particularly at night. Let's think about some of the weather and other environmental factors we've got here. When you're in the jungle, there's going to be very little light during night because of the canopy. So you might have a full moon. None of that light is going to get down to the track where you're trying to walk. So if there is a turn, if there is a junction, it's going to be very difficult to work out which is the main track and which is a side track. The next episode, we're going to delve a little bit more into the map question because I think that this is another area where New Guinea Force could have done a much better job in preparing the troops for combat. We now think about rainfall. There's a lot of it. What does that mean? What's the so what of that? It means that many of the creeks are going to be flowing very fast and make it difficult to cross. It also means that it's going to be muddy. It also means that it's going to be harder to move by foot across that terrain. Lastly, we've got the heat. It's very hot in New Guinea. How many heat casualties were there? I don't know because I don't think that they were tracking it that closely because there were very little medical resources. We know that one of the big risks for anyone getting heat stress, heat stroke, is an existing disease. So many of the troops had malaria, some of them had dysentery, some of them had scrub typhus. Many of these things will give you an elevated temperature. That is going to predispose you to heat injuries. So I would suspect that there was a large number of heat casualties. Now we're going to move on to analysis of the threat. In the doctrine, the JIPOE applies the overarching term threat in preference to adversary. So a threat can come from operational, occupational, or environmental conditions that result from the capability to cause harmful effects either by their nature or from a conscious choice to cause harm. Threats are contextual and can be influenced by many factors, including ideology, culture, social and religious values, political objectives, and geography. Some threats are enduring, while others are temporary. There are three kinds of threats that are listed: operational threats, occupational threats, and environmental threats. So operational threats are threats posed to defence assets, personnel, equipment, facilities, and information by the adversary. Operational threats may include conventional military adversaries, as well as criminals, issue-motivated groups, and civilian disturbances. So from an operational point of view, we're really thinking about the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. This is a nice, simple one to be able to do. Occupational threats. These are threats that are posed to defence assets by friendly personnel, actions, procedures, systems, or equipment. They include biological, chemical, physical, psychosocial, and human factors. They also include the risks posed by individual actions, conditions, and characteristics. Occupational threats are conditions and hazards that result from choices most often made without the intent to cause harm. As I read through that, I'm kind of struggling to understand why would we be thinking about occupational threats. Oh wait, it does talk about biological. I would put dysentery into this category. The 53rd Battalion had their first death from dysentery quite early in their deployment to Port Moresby, within 2 weeks. It certainly wouldn't be the last of the dysentery deaths that would be experienced by New Guinea Force. When we look at the medical support that needed to be provided on the Kokoda track, we're going to talk a lot more about dysentery because I think it's really important. We kind of forget about just the importance of that hygiene factor, making sure that the water is clean, making sure that people are carrying out those precautions to ensure that they're able to fight. Same in environmental threats. So these are threats posed to defence assets by fauna, flora, and other natural elements. They equally affect all parties in the Joint Force area of operations and include severe climate phenomena, geophysical activity, and infectious communicable diseases. When threats such as these have no centres of gravity or clear courses of action, JIPOE provides scenarios that describe the possible impact of the threat situation on friendly forces. Well, this is another one that you could think, well, what's that in there for? Wait, there are 4 different types of Plasmodium species that are to varying degrees endemic within PNG. This is a single-cell protozoan parasite, and it causes malaria. So there's 4 different types of malaria that are widespread throughout PNG. How do you get malaria? Well, it's spread by the Anopheles mosquitoes, and there's 10 different species of those. One of the interesting things about the analysis of the terrain, of the operational environment, reminds me of Freddie Spencer Chapman's book, The Jungle is Neutral. Both the Japanese and the Australians need to contend with the operational environment. From a malaria and dysentery point of view, it's interesting because the Australians tended to do worse with dysentery, and it was the Japanese who were more impacted by malaria. However, sickness was a huge impediment for combat effectiveness for both sides. We will leave our discussion of the JIPOE there. Next week, we're going to look at maps, the importance of maps, and what happens when you're trying to fight in the jungle without maps.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.